Hello, this is Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. I'm Stephen Meyer, and this is part 4, the last part of a series based on my essay entitled Metal Mindfulness, Enhancing Mental Health with Heavy Music. And throughout this series, I have been arguing that heavy metal, yes, heavy metal, can be an excellent tool for encouraging mindfulness or for helping us stay in the present, to stay in the now. That's the state when we're at our healthiest and typically at our happiest. We're not dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. We're totally engaged in the now. And we can use heavy music to, if we concentrated on it enough, we can use it to help us stay present. Okay. All right, in this last part, I'm going to do a couple of things. We're going to start off by talking about the importance of your metal environment or your music listening environment and how this can affect how successful you are in being able to use music as a tool for mindfulness or for staying present. So I'm going to mention a few things to keep in mind in that section. Then I'm going to do a conclusion for the series. I'll bring in a couple new things and recap a thing or two as well. And then we'll finish with a few recommendations that I'm going to make, or just suggestions, I guess, of bands that I think are particularly good for achieving mindfulness. Okay, based on how I've kind of described it throughout this series. All right, so let's get ripping along here. All right, so spruce up your metal environment or your music environment in general. Okay, so when enjoying music as a backdrop, say to your chores or maybe for a social event, it's likely of little importance how good things sound. I mean, the music, as long as it sounds half decent, probably that's fine because people are sort of half concentrating on other things anyway, right? But when using music to encourage mindfulness, there is no substitute for clarity. Clarity is absolutely king here, right? Now, I'm not going to need to convince the audiophiles out there about the value in stereo equipment upgrades. Okay, which I guess I'm somewhat of an audiophile. And yes, anytime I have a few extra dollars, I'm usually tempted to upgrade my stereo system because I know the more clarity I can get, typically the happier I am because I want to listen to music even more and the more content I am, etc. Right. So for me, it's always a good investment for me. But I know there's folks out there who would rather not pay hundreds or thousands of dollars for elite component boxes and connector cables and what have you. But the good news is there are relatively inexpensive choices anyone can make to enhance clarity in their music. And again, like I say, that's absolutely key for achieving mindfulness. For active listening, particularly the non-judgmental side and earlier parts of this series, you'll probably remember that I define non-judgmental active listening. That's when you're really immersing yourself in the music, and you're typically concentrating on specific parts of the music, right? That again, you're not thinking about the past, you're not thinking about the future. You're totally engaged in the moment, and you're following those bass lines, or you're seeing how the rhythm guitar and the lead guitars are interacting, or you're really focusing on those lyrics. Okay, so for active listening, I think one should strive for as much transparency and defined sound stage as possible. So these are kind of the keys for clarity. And so transparency refers to the comprehensibility of each instrument. All right. So how clearly you can hear each instrument, the drums, the bass, the vocals, the background vocals, the cymbals, how transparent is each portion of the music. The more transparent, the better, right? And the defined sound stage, that's basically how the instruments lie in the musical field. So let's say, hopefully, if you're in stereo, right, that's where you have the idea, or on headphones too, where say the vocals are at 12 o'clock, the lead vocals, and the background vocals are just off center a little bit. And maybe you've got, the lead guitar or the rhythm guitar is panned hard left and the keyboards are hard right. and the bass and the kick drum are underneath. They're center but underneath, right? And you got the toms just off to the side, and when the lead guitar kicks in, it comes in at 12 o'clock, that sort of thing, right? So the more separation you have in the instruments, typically the clearer they're going to be as well, and it's easier for you to follow particular instruments or the interactions between the instruments, etc., if you have a good sound stage. So again, the more defined your sound stage, the better, the clearer things are, right? Okay, so certainly a surround sound system will achieve this. If you're using that, you probably have a pretty well-developed sound stage that kind of goes all around you. And hopefully, and usually the instruments are pretty clear in surround sound as well. I personally am a big fan of the more traditional setup, just the two-speaker approach, with or without a subwoofer, actually. I mean, it's really important, though, that the speakers are positioned properly and that they're in phase, and they're able to produce an accurate soundstage. So there's something you can do for free, or at least very inexpensively. I mean, double check to make sure, if you are using a speaker system, you know, that your speakers are in phase, that you're actually hearing in stereo, right? And you can, and there's no substitute for just experimenting. Move your speakers around, see if you can find that sweet spot, and make sure you're in the best spot, that you're in position in between. You know, move your chair around, or if you're laying down or whatever, right? That can immensely help you achieve better clarity and better soundstage, and it probably won't cost you very much, right? So don't be afraid to reposition your speakers and where you are in relation to your speakers. And if you got to maybe rearrange the furniture a bit, I mean, it's all well worth it for clarity. Certainly all-in-one systems are fine as long as decent clarity is achieved. That's obviously another option, and they've come a long way. Some all-in-one systems where it's not a couple speakers or surround sound, everything's just coming out of one spot, but some of those are pretty good. But anyway, if setting up speakers strategically in a designated listening room is not an option, and I guess not everybody has that option, well then a good set of headphones are another really, really good method. And for some people, they prefer it. Some people actually hear more clarity in the music, and maybe even as good a soundstage with a good set of headphones, right? And there you don't have to worry about positioning your speakers or having a room designated for music or that sort of thing. But even relatively inexpensive headphones nowadays will give you a pretty good soundstage. You know, like it feels over your head, or it feels like it's through your head almost, right? But, if you're using $10 buds, maybe you might want to upgrade that a little bit, right? But you don't have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on headphones. You can get, a decent pair can give you some pretty good clarity, right? Of course, if you want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars, well, you'll get an even better experience, I guess. But you don't have to. You certainly don't have to. Right. But again, anything you can do to increase the clarity is really crucial to this mindfulness thing that I've been talking about throughout this, using music for mindfulness throughout this series. And really the association between an appropriate listening environment and effective active listening for mindfulness. I mean, I guess that's probably fairly straightforward. As I've been advocating throughout this paper, the rewards largely accrue via attentive concentration on the more subtle parts of the musical piece, right? That's what really keeps you in the now. Not just when your mind's drifting and you're just letting the music just do, just sort of listening to it sort of casually, which is fine. Like in some cases, that's totally cool. But when you're trying to use music to keep you in the moment, it's the concentration that's doing that, right? So typically you want to concentrate on the real subtle parts of the music, but if you can't hear it clearly, if these bits can't be heard properly, then none of this is likely to work really well. So it's really good to set up your listening environment, whether that be speakers, surround sound, or headphones, as best you can. All right. Another boost to musical clearness can come by being choosy with the source. So it's not just how you set your environment up or that you get a decent set of headphones or whatever you're doing, right? Be choosy with what you actually listen to, right? And that's whether you're streaming. I mean, the majority of people now, especially the younger folk out there, are probably streaming their music, and that's totally fine. Or whether you're still playing physical products such as CDs and vinyl records. That's sort of what I do. I'm a CD guy still, right? But it doesn't matter. Whatever you're doing, you're going to find the production of music is far from standardized, right? Now, older albums, say things produced prior to 1990, are particularly inconsistent in terms of sound quality and indeed the overall intelligibility, right? I mean, albums produced, I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years are pretty consistent, right? They're all going to sound pretty good. They're going to be pretty clear. They're going to have a pretty good sound stage, right? And in some cases, excellent sound stage and very clear, right? I mean, the only exceptions would be, I don't know, maybe some black metal bands that deliberately underproduce their albums to make them sound really murky, etc. Those probably wouldn't be the ones you'd want to choose for this anyway. That's cool for other reasons, but probably not for mindfulness so much, right? But anyway, the inconsistency of music, especially older music before the 90s, this has created a market for a lot of reissues, right? A lot of these, and these reissues really come in two forms. Sometimes the recordings are remastered, and in some cases they're remixed. Okay, just a word on the two. Remasters are typically superior to the original pressings in terms of clarity. Okay, so that's something we want to keep our eye on, by featuring better transparency of most, if not all, of the instruments and voices. But the original presentation of the music is largely left intact. So if you go for a remastered recording, and there's lots of remasters out there, whether CDs or those are streaming options as well, that you can usually choose which version of an album you want to listen to, right? Usually a remastered version will give you better transparency. Things will be clearer. Every instrument will probably be a little bit clearer. But the overall presentation of the music will largely be the same as the original issue, say, right? A remix it goes a little further than that. A remix can actually be a pretty drastic alteration to an earlier release, and as such usually raises the anger of the purists. Don't mess with Black Sabbath Paranoid. You can't remix that. Some people get really upset. But anyway. But because any of the musical pieces components can be completely re-emphasized, right? Okay, so we can debate all day if that's good or bad, but nevertheless, the one thing that is typically true of remixes, they will usually provide greater clarity as well, even if the songs are presented in a new format, right? Okay, so my point here is, if you're using music as a catalyst for staying in the moment, I would definitely gravitate towards the better recorded albums, right? And for me, and especially if I'm listening to older albums, I almost always am going to listen to a remastered version of it if I can, because I know it's going to be clearer, right? And then sometimes I don't have a lot of remixes. I have a few, but for those of you streaming, you usually have access to all this stuff. A remix can be a good choice too for staying in the moment, because the remix will give you something new to listen to, especially if it's an old favorite. If you choose the remix, well, now your brain's got something new to focus on, how it sounds different from the original, so to speak, right? The types of things, though, you want to steer away from, at least in terms of using music for mindfulness, listening, for example, to raw live recordings of cherished bootlegs. Again, that's for another time. That's for another purpose, right? I have a pretty good collection, for example, of old Alice Cooper bootlegs, the original Alice Cooper group, which I love, and I'm very proud of them, right? But they lack transparency. They don't have much sound stage at all. So if I'm using music to stay in the present, I'm not going to pick a bootleg, right? I'm going to pick one of my best recordings. And if it's an older album, it's probably going to be a remaster. All right. So in addition to making sure my environment's set up as best I can, where my speakers are positioned properly, and doing upgrades when I can afford them and all that kind of stuff, and then choosing good sources, that will help. Again, when I want to use music for mindfulness, that's going to help enhance the clarity, and that's what I'm going to try to go for. All right. Okay, so let's bring a few conclusions in and sort of wrap this series up. All right. Happiness is in the simplicity of the moment. So, putting this back to kind of where we started with, some philosophers in some ways. So much of philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's writings would actually be too convoluted, too dark, too bombastic, even though I love Nietzsche. I guess he is kind of all these things, but they'd be too dark, convoluted, and bombastic for most new age peace-seeking sages and punters, like people who subscribe to this, much like, I guess you could argue, heavy metal is unlikely to attract typical meditators and yoga enthusiasts, right? Yet, contemporary spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle does concur with Nietzsche on one important item: immediate simplicity is a key to happiness, and the joy of being in the moment is found in seemingly unremarkable things. The act of listening to music, right? As an example, Nietzsche proclaimed in his classic Thus Spoke Zarathustra over 100 years ago, actually, little maketh up the best happiness. Be still, right? Tolle elaborates on Nietzsche in his book, A New Earth. A high degree of alertness is required. Be still, look, listen, be present, i.e. be in the moment, right? For those who appreciate music, the simple act of listening can be amongst the most calming and enjoyable of activities. In this essay, I've tried to demonstrate how heavy music in particular can be utilized to cultivate mindfulness and thereby, at least temporarily, peace of mind. Much of the strategies I outline center on being completely present while concentrating on the more subtle aspects of musical performance, whether that be bass lines, drum fill patterns, vocal guitar interactions, and so on. Please see episodes 2 and 3 of this series where I talk about this in a lot more detail. Okay, how you actually, I'd say the nuts and bolts of using heavy music to achieve mindfulness or to put you in that happy present state, right? So check those out if you haven't. Of course, heavy music has many other more conventional uses, such as to play along to sing along with, to headbang to if you're a metal person, to discuss with friends, for backdrop for chores and workday obligations, to fuel workouts, to enhance celebrations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hey, these completely valid accompaniments with music are really, though, for another time. All right? When using music for mindfulness, full attention is required, right? It's not for background, it's 100% concentration. Or as Tolle would say, a high degree of alertness, and any mind wandering away from totally engaged listening needs to be redirected as often as necessary. All right. So while I realize I'm on new ground here as an advocate for heavy metal mindfulness, I believe the complexity of many forms of metal and hard rock offer the listener a wealth of musical possibilities to focus upon and thereby help anchor one to the moment. And that's the goal here, to stay present, because that's when we're at our healthiest. Use droning ambient music if you must. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, because that's what most people would do. But for me, hey, I'm going for Iron Maiden or something similar to that. That's what works for me. I encourage my fellow metal supporters to consider this alternative approach to consuming heavy music and see if it helps lessen some burdens as well. And so just to wrap this up, I've got a few suggestions. I mean, there's tons and tons and tons of albums I could recommend that are great for, very, very astute concentration and staying in the moment and helping us achieve mindfulness. But here's a few to get people started if you've never really considered this before. Some good choices anyway, I think. All right. So a few choices, a few albums or works by various artists that are really great for achieving metal mindfulness. All right. And what unites all of these choices that I'm quickly going to go through is what I believe is sort of the magic sauce here, really. They're all complex and challenging. I think that's really important. You can use simple albums for this, but I think it's harder to keep your attention on very simple albums, and it's harder to keep your mind from wandering, right? So you need to be challenged a little bit when you're listening, right, to achieve mindfulness. I think that's important. So there should be some complexity going on, but at the same time, right, the music should be challenging and complex, but for most people, it should still be accessible. That's why I'm not going to recommend some of the extreme stuff. There are some extreme bands that I actually use for mindfulness as well, but I know it's probably just too out there, maybe a little too disturbing, that it would probably throw some people off. So I'm not going to mention the works from those types of bands. These are bands that are complex and challenging, but they're still accessible. They still have, there's still choruses you can latch onto, or guitar riffs that again have some hooks, that sort of thing. And then, as we were just talking about, these are also recordings that are really clear. They're well-produced albums, right? So all of these have those three characteristics, which I think, again, are sort of the key points that'll help you achieve metal mindfulness, if you like. Okay, and not all of this is super heavy metal. Some of this is kind of proggy too, but all these works are at least quite heavy, if not metal. So, I mean, Iron Maiden and Rush are maybe the poster bands for this type of thing, at least as far as I'm concerned, because both bands, I mean, the musicianship's through the roof. Your concentration can dwell just on one instrument, or the incredible interactions going on amongst the instruments. The songs are really well written. But it's still accessible. It's complex. It's challenging. The works of Iron Maiden and Rush, really their whole discographies, right? But it's still accessible. They still have choruses, and there's still hooks in the music, etc. And they all record really good albums. All these albums are well produced, right? So what I would steer people towards, though, tends to be some of the latter day material by both of these bands, because they haven't been played quite so much, right? So a couple recommendations I might make is Dance of Death and A Matter of Life and Death. Complex, really complex music going on, incredible instrumentation going on, but still accessible, really well produced. And same with the last two albums by Rush, Snakes and Arrows and Clockwork Angels, right? But you can really pick anything from their catalogs. If you want to go for the well-known stuff, so for Maiden, you want to do Number of the Beast, or for Rush, you want to listen to 2112. I mean, that's fine. But as I argue in part 3, if you're going to use a really well-known album to try to achieve mindfulness, then you got to listen for things you wouldn't normally listen to, right? So don't worry about the choruses that you know so well, or the guitar riffs that you've heard over and over. Concentrate on the subtle little things. How's the drummer and the bass player interacting? Right? I'm going to really follow those drum fills on those albums, that sort of thing. So you're listening for different things. All right. Okay. But really, anything from those bands would be perfect for this type of thing. I think most of Opeth's catalog would be a great choice. I will steer people away from the early Opeth stuff, even though they have some absolute masterpieces. I mean, some people will consider Blackwater Park and Still Life as probably the greatest Opeth albums. And again, they're heavy, very proggy, very complicated, but not real accessible. So I wouldn't steer people into that if you're not familiar with Opeth. But really, anything since Ghost Reveries, I would say absolutely. They've lost the death growl at this point. They're playing heavy, but they're probably as much prog and, I'm going to say prog metal, but actually even just prog at this point. But again, quite accessible. There's a lot of really pretty melodies going on, but the music is still really challenging. So really anything since, 2005 would work great for Opeth, would be a fantastic choice. And there's so much, every time you hear an Opeth album, the next time you listen to it, you're going to hear new things. There's just so much going on, but not so much that you become alienated, if you know what I mean. You'll latch on to it, but it's not so far, it's not freeform jazz or something. There's still things you can latch on to. Porcupine Tree is maybe the epitome of a more modern band that fits this description. They are proggy, they are heavy a lot of the times, but they're incredibly accessible, right? I mean, everything they do pretty much has lots of hooks and melody, and that's sort of, I mean, they're almost a pop band that's also incredibly proggy and incredibly complex in terms of the musicality of their approach. I mean, they're really kind of a unicorn in some ways. And the other thing about them too, the mastermind of Porcupine Tree is Steven Wilson. Well, he's become almost the go-to guy for production. He's been responsible for a lot of remixes of some of those older prog bands. He's done some remixes for Rush, for Jethro Tull, for Yes, for a bunch of bands. So you have the best of all worlds here. You've got complex music that's really accessible and produced absolutely state of the art, as clear can be. Right. So again, Porcupine Tree, I named a couple albums there. Their latest one would be a great place to start if you've never heard of them. Stupid Dreams, an older album, which would be perfect as well. But really take your pick. Right. Arena, another heavy prog band where I could pretty much say the same thing. You could pretty much pick anything from their catalog. It's all complicated but accessible. Right. Almost like if Pink Floyd were heavy metal, you might have Arena, if that might give you a ballpark, right? So, hey, Contagion's a classic. Their latest one would be a great place to start. But again, you pretty much pick anything from their catalogs. Again, everything's produced really well. They're very clear in their presentation, but lots of accessibility, but lots of twists and turns in the music. Keep you challenged, keep you focused as well, keep you in the now. Amorphous, another really interesting, heavy band, but very proggy and very accessible at the same time. I would steer away from their earliest albums because they're pretty death metal. And yes, they still, even in their latest album, Halo, which is a masterpiece, they do work in a few death growls here and there, but most of the vocals are clean with lots of big swirling choruses, but lots different types of instruments in there, lots of different twists and turns. Really interesting band. So I wouldn't go for the real early stuff. It's probably a little too death metalish for a lot of people, but anything since Elegy, I think, would work for almost anybody. Paradise Lost, more a doom band, but a really interesting complex doom band. Their really early stuff, again, would be too doomy for a lot of people, lots of death metal growls, so you'd steer clear of that perhaps. But since Draconian Times, in between Draconian Times and Faith Divides Us, Death Unites Us, again, I think would fit. Most people could get into that. Lots and lots of melody. The music's pretty depressing, admittedly, but again, lots of different proggy moments, I guess I would sort of say that. Lots of different, the musicianship through the roof, lots of things to follow. Somewhat weirdly, their latest couple albums are probably more of a regression to death doom, so you might want to steer clear of that if that throws you off a bit, right? But otherwise, the majority of their catalog would fit in with those criteria, right? It's complex, it's challenging, but it's very accessible and very well produced. Dream Theater, kind of the poster child for prog metal. That might be the band most people think of when you think of the prog metal genre. I mean, musicianship completely unmatched. The players in Dream Theater now, or anybody who's been in Dream Theater, they've had some members move on to other things. And, again, pick your album. 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence would be a great place to start, but their latest one would be fine too. Right. Again, really complex, I would say, maybe a little too complex for some people. But hey, if you stick with it, right. Again, Dream Theater is the type of band if you listen to the albums a few times, it'll start to make sense. Right. And again, lots of melody. The singer is very smooth. Right. So again, I think it checks all the boxes, so to speak. Flying Colors, kind of a super group in some ways, a heavy prog band. Steve Morris is in the band, probably best known for his work with Deep Purple and Dixie Dregs. Neil Morris, no relation, but again, master writer. He used to be with Spock's Beard. Now he's in all kinds of bands. Mike Portnoy, drummer, again, was in Dream Theater. He's Transatlantic, he's in Winery Dogs, all kinds of things. Excellent drummer. Same deal though. They only have 3 albums, but again, really accessible, very proggy, very interesting, lots to keep your attention. And finally, King's X. I wouldn't call King's X prog, but they're proggy. They're heavy, but they're incredibly accessible, right? Very melodic. Really almost anything in their catalog I think would work. They got a couple albums that are a little simpler, so maybe not the first album, but by the second album, Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, there's lots of complexity going on. Always really well produced. The musicianship is just crazy good. The background vocals, the harmony vocals they're fun to just concentrate on that. The singing is just that good. So really almost anything by them. And you could go right to their latest one. 3 Sides of One would be a great choice as well. All right. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas. There's lots of other things I could mention, But again, complex yet challenging, accessible, and clearly recorded. That's, I think, what you want to go for when you're making a choice as to which album should I pick to try to keep me in the present, to really concentrate on. Those might be some good choices for folks out there. Okay, well, that's the series. Thank you so much for checking this out. Whether you watch the whole thing, wowee, thank you very much. Or even if you just check me out for a couple minutes, that's awesome too. So thank you so much. I'll be back again, as I always threaten. I'm coming back. Don't know when, but I'm coming back. In the meantime, I wish you all the very, very best. Take care.